Hi everyone, this is Yana, and today I have several cards for you that feature fun watercolor die cuts and background that looks like it has been expertly painted using watercolor. Let's take a look at the supplies that I'm going to be using today. First, I have several new dies from Spellbinders from their Inspire line. These are some fun summer and themed images. I have a crab, two kinds of fish, a sandcastle, a fun sun, and some palm trees and a koi fish die. I'm going to be die cutting all of these for my projects today. Now, to create that watercolor look that I'm talking about, I'm going to use spray inks from ClearSnap. You don't have to use this product. You can use your usual watercolors. I'm using these spray inks because I like the vibrant colors that they give me, and also because I don't have any watercolor paints. I'm intentionally not buying any because I have a lot of products in my stash that can give me a watercolored look. The colors that I have here are Lemon Drop, Grasshopper, Glacier Lake, Mermaid, and Pinkalicious. I do want to point out that I ended up using more colors that I have here, as I actually made several additional watercolor sheets, and I'll list the names of the spray ink colors that I used in my video description and also on my blog. Now, you don't have to use these particular inks. Like I said, this is a watercolor technique, so you can use watercolors for this, or any dye spray inks that you might have, or even re-inkers. I also have this fun stamp set from Mama Elephant, and I'm going to use this Go On and Celebrate sentiment from here, as well as the little stars. I really like the font. It's fun and playful, and I think it's perfect for the idea that I have in mind today. Finally, I have a sheet of watercolor paper. This is regular watercolor paper, nothing fancy or extra special, just a regular watercolor paper. And I also have an old paintbrush and a cup of water here. So let's start creating our watercolor background. I'm going to do a wet watercolor. I'm going to add water to my paper before I add any color. This is going to help that color to spread around, and it's also going to prevent that color from going into the paper right away and making that particular paper area very saturated. I've already shared several videos with this technique, and I'll link to a few here for you to check out if you like. If you've seen them before, you might want to skip ahead a minute or two and jump directly to the die cutting part of this video. So I'm starting with yellow, and I'm randomly adding it to my paper. I'm using the spray bottle tube to add color directly to my paper and then spraying it around with my paintbrush. There is absolutely no rhyme or reason as to what I'm doing here. I'm simply adding color as I like. After I've added yellow, I'm going to add water to another area of my paper and move on to the next color, to a light blue, and I'm going to let the color spread one into the other. I'm using my heat tool to dry my paper and also to move the water with the color on the paper surface to create fun effects for my background. You can let it sit and dry on its own, but it's going to take much longer. Or you can add all the colors you like and dry your paper afterwards. But some colors, when mixed together, produce an ugly brown color, so I would suggest drying your paper in between colors unless you want those colors, those particular colors to mix. So I'm simply adding color as I like. I do have to point out that depending on the size of the die that you plan to use, you might want to have smaller or larger areas of one color. For example, that top left yellow area is a bit too big for the size of the die cuts that I have today. It would have been better to add another color there on top. So after my watercolor paper is completely dry, I can start creating my die cuts and building my card. I've trimmed this paper to a smaller size so that it would fit inside my Artisan Explorer machine, and I've already placed a few dies and taped them down with a piece of tape. I'm now going to cut them and also emboss them to give them a bit of texture and dimension. As soon as I'm done with this, you can see the truly gorgeous effect and look that these die cuts have. If I were to first die cut them and then watercolor, I would have never had this beautiful look. And I'm honestly bad at watercoloring. Spreading color onto a solid background is like the only thing I can do when it comes to watercolor. But this looks truly amazing and so beautiful. And the best part, even a child can do this. Really, give your children some watercolors and ask them to make a yucky background and then die cut it, and you're going to have beautiful die cuts for your projects. So now that I have my die cuts ready, and you can see I die cut quite a bit of those, I have to say this is really very addictive. I can start working on my card. I'm going to stamp the Go On and Celebrate sentiment from Mama Elephant onto a panel of white cardstock, and this is cut just slightly smaller than the A2 card base, which is 4¼ by 5½ inches, and I'm going to stamp this sentiment using VersaFine Onyx Black ink. This is by far my most favorite ink for stamping outline images and sentiments. I'm also going to stamp several little stars around the sentiment just to fill in the background. You can also add these little stars later, but for me, it's just easier to stamp them right away. So now it's time for the magic to happen. I'm going to use my die cuts and I'm going to place them around this stamped sentiment. I'm starting with a sandcastle. I'm adding some palm trees there to the right and a sun die cut at the top and some fish to fill in the gaps. Now what's cool about these watercolor die cuts is that no two are the same. Even if you try to make them look the same or identical, they probably won't. Each time you do this, you're going to have a completely different look, and I absolutely love this. This is actually the reason why I made so many cards. I just couldn't stop making these watercolor backgrounds and creating those die cuts. It was super fun, so just give it a try and you'll know what I mean. Okay, after I figured out how I wanted these die cut pieces placed, I grabbed my foam squares and started adhering sea creatures to my stamped panel. Now, I do have to say that this entire design and entire idea was inspired by a day at Disneyland. We went there last month after CHA show in Anaheim, and it was just lovely. The endless blue sky, the tall palm trees, the super green grass, oh, it was just magical. Okay, I'm now going to use my paper trimmer to trim all the extra pieces of my watercolor die cuts. You can do this with your scissors, but it was just much easier for me to cut them using a paper trimmer. And by the way, be sure to keep those pieces. You can still use them on a different card. I reused a lot of those for my next projects. Now, since some of my die cuts were overlapping my stamping, I decided I wanted to add that stamping on top of the die cuts. Probably not the best idea since these were all adhered using foam adhesive and I wasn't able to stamp the image perfectly, but I stamped it a bit and then used my black Copic marker and just filled in all those gaps where the ink didn't transfer. It wasn't that hard to do, and I do think that my card started to look a bit better after I did that. To finish this particular project, I added foam adhesive to the back of my watercolor panel and adhered it onto an A2 top folding card, which I made using layering paper from Hero Arts. I love this particular paper for card bases because it has color on the outside and is white on the inside. I also added a couple of black pearls from One to Scrap, and that finished my project. Okay, let's move on to the second one, or the second technique. This time, I did everything the same, but before die cutting and embossing my images, I added a layer of adhesive to the back of my watercolor paper using scrapbook adhesive sheets. It's a fun product which saves you a lot of time when you need to adhere your die cuts onto your paper. So basically, I just turned my watercolor paper into a large watercolor sticker. I die cut it using my dies and ended up having a pile of beautiful die cut watercolor stickers. And honestly, this is like my favorite technique. You just add the adhesive to the back of your paper before you cut it and you have a sticker. So easy. So now that I have a bunch of those stickers, I'm going to adhere them directly onto an A2 top folding card base. This time, I'm not using any foam adhesive and I'm not adding those die cuts around the sentiment. I'm actually building a background using my die cuts. Now, I also did this on a black card base and it looked awesome. A lot more vibrant, I guess. But it still looks very nice on white too. So after I created my background, I once again trimmed the extra pieces using my paper trimmer. And look at that background. Because there is no dimension from the foam adhesive, if you look at it from a distance, it looks like a real painted watercolored background. And you don't see the die cuts, you just see the beautiful watercolor images. Sometimes, some types of adhesive do not want to stick, especially if you're using watercolor paper. So what I like to do to force that adhesive to stick is to run the piece through my die cutting machine and add pressure so that adhesive really grabs onto whatever you're adding on top. Now, the tricky part is not to add too much pressure. Over the years, I found that it's best to use a die cutting sandwich for this. So just place your card in between your plates and run it through your machine. If you want to protect it from the texture that the die cutting plates have from all the die cutting, you can put a piece of paper on the plate and then put your project on top of that. Now, this is going to work slightly different in other machines, so be sure to test this in your machine before you send the actual project through. In some cases, the pressure might be too high, so it's going to obliterate all of that embossing. So this is just something to keep in mind when doing this. If you are not using adhesive sheets but adhering your die cuts using glue, you have nothing to worry about at all and can just skip the whole pressure part. Okay, it's time to finish our card. I'm going to add a Let's Celebrate sentiment from Cosmo Cricut using foam squares, and I'm going to embellish the card with a few little black pearls. So this finished my today's project. I hope you enjoyed watching this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up. And if you're new to my channel, please remember to subscribe. You can find the list of supplies I used to create these cards in the video description and also on my blog. If you'd like to see more videos using dies from Spellbinders, be sure to check out the link you see on the screen. Thanks for watching! Bye!